Okay. Let's start with this Signal chat leak. Let's start there because it is a pretty
Mm,
extraordinary extraordinary event. What's
mm,
incredible is several things. One, of course, they use Signal, which apparently even the
mm,
Pentagon itself officially um, put out a notice to its own people saying don't use that. It is vulnerable to
yeah.
Russian hackers. So that's what Pentagon's own
Mm,
announcement too. And then this whole time they have a meeting of the supposed to be 17 people, but 18, with one extra, and nobody noticed that, right? I
mm,
find that's pretty extraordinary. It is Mike Waltz who brought him in, and not only he didn't think it twice about that, but nobody else during the meeting. And then once this whole thing happened, it seems like nobody know about what happened until he himself wrote about it. So the whole
mm.
thing, can we say, is a serious security breach, isn't it?
It is a very serious security breach. I mean, by the way, Signal, just to say, was originally a Russian system. So I'm not saying that means that the Russians can simply
Uh-huh.
break the encryption, but
Yeah.
probably they have a fair understanding of how it works. And it clearly isn't secure, and it is a commercial system. Now, about 2 weeks ago, as it happens, I was provided with a whole description of the security protocols for communications within the Kremlin.
Okay.
And they are incredibly detailed,
Hmm.
and they show how, what you can do and what you can't do. I'm going to make a guess that the security protocols in Zhongnanhai are at
Hmm.
least as tight.
Yeah.
Using something like Signal seems absolutely bizarre. So bizarre that I am starting to wonder. Now, I don't know this. What I'm going to say now, I don't know for a fact, but this is my guess. This is a guess, and I want to stress it's just a
Hmm.
guess. But I wonder whether this was quite as, negligent as it looks, whether somebody didn't make a decision to leak information about this meeting to Jeffrey Goldberg,
Okay.
that because using a um, American government communication network would probably have been against the law, and would have been certainly against the law,
Hmm.
and would have been against the law for Goldberg to do. That's why they decided to use Signal. And that Goldberg, who I believe is widely assumed to have connections with Israeli intelligence, he was apparently a soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces at
Hmm.
one time. He obviously would have an interest in knowing what the Americans were doing in Yemen and who was
Hmm.
for it and who was against it. And he was there basically to keep track of the discussion in that way so that Jerusalem could be kept informed. But somebody then realized that because his name was there, the fact that he'd been involved in the discussion would eventually be noticed. And so a decision was made to rush out a story in the Atlantic about this incident in order to give Goldberg himself and the person who arranged this thing First
Hmm.
Amendment Act protection, because then
Okay.
it becomes a new story. The First Amendment Act says that you can't interfere with what the media does,
Hmm.
and whether that was really what it was all about. In other words, that it wasn't quite as innocent and mere incompetence as it looks. And who it was who did this, I don't know.
Hmm.
But given that it came from Mike Waltz, it points to someone within the National Security Council.
Okay.
This is my theory
Uh-huh.
about this. But
Okay.
put all that aside, I can't imagine that if something like this had been attempted in the Kremlin or Zhongnanhai,
Hmm.
somebody wouldn't have noticed immediately. And they wouldn't have said, just a moment, what are we doing using Signal? And who is
Hmm.
this guy Goldberg? And what is he doing here? I think that, you can put the kind of spin on it that I have just done, but it doesn't alter the fact that it looks like an extremely serious security lapse. and it suggests a government that is basically run by amateurs.
Yeah, that's that's what I would say. They in China, of course, a lot of people pointing out, right, that they're talking about Huawei is a national security threat, TikTok is a national security threat, everything about China is a national security threat. Here you have the highest level, meeting security. It should be very, very highly classified information, and they were chatting about, and yet you just did this so casually. So what are you guys doing,
Yeah.
right? So that's the ironic part of it, I think.
But I mean, people, you're absolutely right about that, and people in the Chinese media who are saying the social media who are saying that absolutely right as well. The Americans have a completely reckless approach to sensitive information. I mean, America leaks like a sieve. We all know that it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Greenwald, he pointed out that on the one hand, lots of things are very secretive, right? How long they kept the Kennedy file
Yeah,
secret. Even things when
yeah,
you read them, some of them are really not that important, but they kept it secret. On the other hand,
yeah,
they kept on leaking out things that you would think that should be highly classified, but they keep on doing it for whatever purposes they are doing, right? So there is a contradictory
yeah.
how the US government behaves when it's about security information. Yeah.
Yes, because its approach to information is very manipulative. I
Uh-huh.
mean, they leak what they call classified information in order to basically manipulate opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so they play this constant game of giving us tidbits of information, which they say is obtained secretly, and then they don't really tell us very much about how it's obtained. And clearly, they also brief their so-called friends. And the thing to understand about the American government is that it's not friends in the same way as we have, China has,
Mm-hmm.
Russia has. It's just, people know each other.
Yeah.
There's this ardent support for Israel in some places. And Goldberg may be seen as an Israeli intelligence officer, but that makes it even more important for some people that he should be party to discussions. So America runs in a
Mhm.
completely different way from any other capital of any other great power. It's quite bizarre. It's very difficult for outsiders to understand. And of course, the absurdities of it, the inconsistencies in it, the recklessness involved in it, and the hypocrisy as well. I mean, you're talking about Huawei.
Mhm.
I mean, it reeks to the heavens, but there it is.
Yeah, just so you know, I read an article not that long ago about how they disassemble and taking down the Huawei base station. Turns out Huawei
Mm,
has 6,000 base stations already built in the
yeah,
US when this ban in
yeah,
Huawei took place. So the government,
yeah.
I think first the Trump administration, I guess, was giving some money to the telecom companies because this is a cost for them to
Mm,
taking down the Huawei base station and they have to build new ones, right?
mm,
And that money
yeah.
quickly ran out. And so when I was reading the article, was probably 6 months ago, there were only 300 to 400 base station was taken down.
Mm,
So less than
yeah.
10% of the Huawei base station. The rest of them still, as far as we know, still there and service. So so they can't really believe this is a serious national security threat. If
No.
that's the attitude,
Mm,
that's how they implement this ban, right?
yeah. I think it's entirely right. I mean, that makes complete sense to me. I mean, it's just a lot of this now that happens in the West is just politicians,
Mhm.
people who have very little understanding of these things, making decisions, writing out orders, not really thinking very far or very long about what it is exactly that they're doing.
We did get some information from this chat, which I find interesting. One is Vance actually
Mm,
kind of like protested a little bit that thinking what he said was,
yeah,
well, only 3% of the US transportation, the cargoes go through the Red Sea.
yeah,
It doesn't really affect us that much. On the other hand, the Europeans, 40% of their cargoes go through the Suez Canal.
mm,
So why are we doing this for the Europeans? So he's against this bombing, right? And then Pete Hegseth
Yeah.
was saying, well, we still need to do that. And it seems like in the end, they agreed that the Europeans need to pay for
Yeah.
this or something. What is your view on that?
Well, it was a completely frivolous discussion. I mean, such an important decision. We're told that the president has already made the decision, but notice that he isn't even participating. They all come together. They all come up with, out, top of the head ideas. Nobody really sits down. I mean, it again shows what a completely amateur place the American government is. And by the way, I don't think it's any different with any other administration. I don't think things were any more organized under Biden or Clinton or Bush or the two Bushes or any Obama or anybody. I mean, these are just decisions made um, without any real consideration or without any proper thought. Vance, who strikes me as the single most intelligent
Mhm.
person in the room, says, I think this is a mistake,
Mhm.
but he's very reluctant to push back
Mhm.
against the consensus. He
Mhm.
says that he will go along with the consensus.
Mhm.
He comes up with this point about, it's the Europeans that benefit, not us. So why are we letting them freeload on us? Which is a point, but it's surely not the most important or relevant point about, about this whole thing. And I mean, again, I can't help but think that, if people in Zhongnanhai and the
Mhm.
standing committee
Mhm.
of the Politburo and all the rest and the secretariat and all of that are reading and looking at this, they'll say, is this the kind of government that we have to deal with? I mean, that they make decisions like this basically back of the envelope thinking. I mean, it must be very, very concerning. I
Mhm.
mean, you would have expected, at least a week of substantive and detailed discussions, military officials called in, real proper discussion as to how this is done. But no, in
Mhm.
America, things are not done that way. Not anymore.
Yeah, this is a point that some of my viewers also, when I was discuss this with them, that how
Yeah,
light the whole, decision.
yeah,
This is we're talking about bombing another country, which is life and death, and they
yeah,
subsequently did bomb
yeah,
Yemen, and there were women and children killed. Okay, so they
yeah,
were discussing
yeah,
life and death, but they took the whole thing very light,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So yeah, I agree. It's just it's scary almost like how easily they just talking about bombing another country. Oh, we don't need to wait another month, and it's going to be the same deal. And then Vance is like, okay, I go
Yeah.
with consensus, and yeah.
Absolutely. And then emojis are used and all of that. I mean, all very inappropriate behavior.
Yeah.
But as I said, I don't think it's any different with anyone else. By the way, I don't think it's very different in London either, just to say.
One more thing is how much they loathe the Europeans, which is interesting. So
Yeah.
this is what JD Vance said. I just hate bailing Europe out again. And Pete Hegseth says, I fully
Mm.
share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. Does the
Yeah.
Europeans, I mean, you talked about this the last time, right? That Trump think the Europeans are just freeloaders and welfare takers, like those sort of people. He looked down on them as well, and apparently his national security team thinking the same way. Does the
Yeah.
Europeans, do they know how they were, how the American think about them, looking down on them so much?
Well, they do. They do now, or at least they increasingly do now. I mean, the British media covered this extensively, and there's a strong feeling of shock about this.
Mhm.
This isn't new, by the way. I mean, I think that there's been this long-standing current of thinking in the US that the Europeans are freeloading on the United States. What this never acknowledges is the extent to which Europe has sacrificed its own interests by going ahead all the time with what the Americans have been doing. I mean, if the European states had not been so subservient to US policies for so long, they might have had completely different policies about the Middle East, which would have avoided this kind of crisis in the Red Sea that we are seeing. The Americans are utterly blind to that, that in fact, yes, the Europeans are weak and they aren't able to do very much and they can't really join in what the Americans are doing. But ultimately, the reason that we have these crises is not because of the Europeans, but because of the Americans themselves.
Mhm. Yeah, and I can't help but thinking, for example, Denmark. Denmark has been doing everything the United States wanted to do. I think they're
Yeah.
also probably part of the Nord Stream bombing. At least it helps with the cover up of it. What does Denmark get? Right now, openly, Trump wants Greenland. Just imagine
Yeah.
if Russia says that, you, Denmark, I want to take Greenland. What kind of reaction you're going to get, right? And here you have the United States openly saying, I want Greenland. And yet, what does Denmark do all this to help the United States? What does it get for Denmark? I don't get it.
Well, well, they don't get anything very much. I mean, once upon a time, say in the 1950s, you could argue that there was that there was a lot of value in the relationship for Europe, at least for Western Europe. I mean, they were protected from socialism, which of course they were worried about. They didn't want socialism to be expanded to them. Certainly, the European middle class, right,
Mhm.
opposed to socialism. So the Americans protected them from all of that. Um, America did arrange for an economic boom to happen in Europe in the 50s because it needed the Europeans to be rich so that they could better resist socialism and all of
Mhm.
this. At that point, you could argue that there was a mutual benefit in the relationship. But over the last 15, 20 years, well, going all the way back maybe to the early 2000s, it's increasingly clear that the relationship has become completely unbalanced and that the Europeans aren't getting anything very much. They're being asked constantly to sacrifice their own interests. We have a deepening economic crisis in Europe, and that is deeply connected to the relationship we have with the Americans. And the Americans are becoming more aggressive towards us and more predatory, but we don't have any longer the political institutions that would help us push back against it. So I don't think we get very much. I think the Americans are sick of us and don't like us. And logically, we should be as well. We should decide to stand on our own feet, rediscover diplomacy, engage with Russia, obviously, because
Mhm.
it's our neighbor, engage with China, because it is the rising economic and technological power. We could do all of these things. Once upon a time, when we were led by real leaders, people like Charles de Gaulle, for example, who was the first important European leader to establish diplomatic relations with China in the 1960s.
Mhm.
When we were led by people like that, we would have seized that chance. Today, we can't because we have people who are not leaders in any meaningful sense anymore.
Yeah. We talked about this before. It seems like if the Cold War ended,
Yeah.
it seems like Europe is the loser. Ultimately, Europe is the loser in the
Yeah.
ending of the Cold War, right?
Yes.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.